Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 136, Kabane and Court Rank. Mononobe no Muraji no Ujimaro was in a foul mood. Once more, he had been passed over for promotion, and so he continued to toil away, tallying reports as they came in from the various provinces across the kingdom. Meanwhile, Hasama no Atahe no Woshibi was now his superior, with an exalted rank and the generous stipend that came with it. Ujimaro fumed. He was Mononobe. His family had once all but ruled Yamato. Though they had been perhaps reduced in circumstances since then, they still proudly held their place as a Muraji family, a distinction that demonstrated their superior pedigree. Meanwhile, Woshibi was from the Hasama family. Sure, his relative Nemaro had been one of those on the front lines in the recent conflict, but still, his family was only Atahe. Honestly, a Mononobe was supposed to take orders from someone of an Atahe family? But this was the new way of things. The ancient traditions were no longer enough. You had to work hard and make your way up through this new court rank system if you wanted to succeed. Ujimaro grumbled, but there was little he could do in the moment. Nonetheless, he couldn't help but think about how the natural order of the world had somehow been turned upside down. Greetings and welcome back, everyone. We are working our way through the reign of Owama, aka Tenmu Tenno. This reign spanned 14 years if you include the Jinshin year of 672, though it's broken into two narratives in the Nihon Shoki. The first chapter covers the year of the disturbance, the Jinshin no Ran, when Owama fought with the Omi court, who supported his nephew Otomo on the throne. We've covered that turbulent period previously. The second chapter covers the other 13 years of Owama's reign. Now, last episode, we covered the first year of Owama actually sitting properly on the throne. The year 673 included Owama's ascension, the confirmation, continuation, and evolution of the Ritsuryo system instituted during Nakano Oe's time, as well as various ceremonies around Owama's ascension to the throne, including the first verifiable Daijosai. That was the specialized harvest ceremony for the first harvest season of a new reign. This episode, we are going to try and tackle something that people have sent in questions about, and really I've been trying to wait until just the right moment to talk about it. We've touched on it here and there, but I really want to get into the Kabane system, that ancient practice of family titles that were like a collective rank system. After all, if we don't talk about it now, probably going to be too late. Now, it was during Owama's reign that the court made major reforms to the Kabane system and restructured it pretty extensively. At the same time, the Kabane system was gradually being replaced by other systems of displaying one's status in society, such as the court rank system, which was also revised during this reign. Eventually, without the same purpose as before, Kabane would fade away, with a few remaining as honorifics and titles, but at this point, they were still important. So we'll get to both these status systems and discuss a little bit about what that meant for the people of the late 7th century court. Now, from the beginning of Owama's reign, the court had continued to implement the cap rank system, most recently amended in 664 by Owama's brother, Nakano Oe. With the new rank system of 685, the format changed considerably. To better understand this, let's talk about the rank systems in Yamato and how we've gotten to this point. We'll want to start with the Kabane, and to do that, I want to take us back to a much earlier time in Yamato history. Now, as you recall, in the oldest stories in the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and the Sendai Kuji Hongi, most individuals were only given a single name, or they're known by the name of a location and a title. Iware Hiko, for example, with Hiko and Hime being general masculine and feminine terms for elites from a given area. From this, it would appear as though there was no such thing as a family name in early Wa societies. As I've pointed out before, that does not mean that there were not families, of course, or that lineage and family relationships were not important. We do see familial relationships, and we see concepts of lateral inheritance from brother to brother, rather than necessarily from father to son. The rules behind such inheritance seem to have been rather malleable, though. And that all makes some sense in a society where most people are dealing with the people of their village and surrounding communities. I mean, there's no need for anything more than a given name in that situation. Otherwise, you could just use one's place of origin or their profession, which could easily be used to identify any given individual. even the elites would just need to be known by the territory that they control. I mention all this because some of the earliest terms we see as kabane appear to be titular in nature, that is to say, they are derived from ancient titles. Hiko, Hime, Wake, Mimi, and Ushi are all terms we see from the ancient past, commonly found in the names of sovereigns, among other things. It isn't until sometime in about the 5th century that we start to see family units arise. These started as something like a corporate guild or group. Those who looked after horses, for example, were all labeled as umakai, while those who worked jade and made magatama jewels were labeled as tamatsukuribe. These groups, or bei or uji, were familial in that they were structured much as a family might be, with a single family head and with inheritance that was related to familial ties. That gave the ruler a single point of contact to presumably administer all of the work that particular corporate group was expected to perform. Furthermore, the name passed down to their children, who would presumably have been brought up in the family business. For some of these families, rather than overseeing a business, craft, or similar thing, they were instead administrators of a given region or locality. We might think of these as chiefly families, overseeing domains of varying sizes. These families were known as uji. This is often translated in English as clan, which is really an overloaded term used to describe a group that all claim familial descent from a single putative ancestor, whether real or fictional. Many of the earliest uji were created as bei groups, abe, mononobe, imbe, kataribe, etc., but they eventually started dropping bei altogether, so we get the inukai, umakai, soga, nakatomi, wani, and things like that. For these uji, many were connected to various deities or kami from which they claimed descent. These kami are thought to be some of the original ujigami, though that term later came to be applied to various kami that were seen as guardians of a particular locale, and later uji need not claim direct descent from a kami for it to be special. For example, the main deity of Kasuga Taisha, the shrine built in Nara in the 8th century, said to house the ujigami of the Nakatomi and Fujiwara, primarily pays worship to Takemikazuchi no Mikoto and Futsunushi no Mikoto, deities brought from the east as far as we can tell. Takemikazuchi is considered an ujigami of the two uji, but the oyagami, the actual parent or ancestral kami from which they claim direct lineage, well, that would be Ame no Koyane no Mikoto, who is also worshipped as the third deity at the shrine, but not the main one. The fact that these uji operate more like clans means that they were made up of numerous family units who might be scattered across the entire archipelago. At the head of each uji would have been a central family to provide the uji leadership and interface with the court. Nonetheless, they were all considered the same uji, and a rise in the fortunes of the uji applied to all of its disparate members. Now, to be clear, there were titles attached to individual names, sukune, for example, which is one we've encountered several times in the narrative. So it wasn't that all titles and honors went to the entire uji, but for the most part, many of these kabane worked in that manner. Now, Professor Kanichi Asakawa, in his work, The Early Institutional Life of Japan, provides an overview of some of these corporate titles that came to be known as kabane. In all likelihood, they all had a straightforward meaning at some point. Omi, for example, seems to mean minister, and it continues to be used in that sense, as well as a title up through at least the 7th century. Another common kabane that we see is Muraji, which appears to originally reference someone in charge of a village or similar polity. Asakawa suggests that this comes from Mura no Ushi, with Ushi meaning something like lord and showing up elsewhere as well. Kimi also appears to be demonstrating some kind of hegemony over a land or territory. And beyond that, there are a few others we've seen. Atahe or Atahe, as well as Suguri, which appears to truly be a lower level village headmaster. Then there's Agata Nushi, aka Agata no Ushi, the lord of an agata or district. Asakawa also notes Wake, Inaki, Sukune, Kishi, and Tametsukasa as other kabane. The kabane are interesting in that they do appear to be precedental. That is to say, there does appear to be some kind of hierarchy in terms of the social position of each uji. For example, if we see who goes on a diplomatic envoy, for example, we generally expect that the chief envoy is going to be of a higher Kabane level than the junior envoy or other people in his retinue. The Kabane, however, did not confer any particular resources. There was no stipend attached to any given Kabane, though certain court positions were only open to members of Uji with the appropriate Kabane. Perhaps most notable in this are the Omi and the Muraji, which were the only two family types that held the supreme court positions, what we would likely refer to as prime ministers. These included families such as the Otomo no Muraji, the Mononobe no Muraji, the Koshi no Omi, and the Soga no Omi. The heads of these families had a special title, the O-Muraji or the O-Omi, the Great Muraji and the Great Omi. These positions were placed at the very top of the court system, just under the sovereign and princes, allowing them unrivaled access to the levers of power. Typically, there were 2 or 3 of these individuals at any given time, down to as few as 1 during the height of the Soga no Omi's power and influence. It's unclear if all Uji at the Omi and Muraji level had a designated O-Omi or O-Muraji at their head, or if that was just for those who were in actual positions at the top of the court structure. It's also unclear if the precedence between the Omi and Muraji was always fixed. Early on, we see a lot of Muraji houses that appear to be holding the majority of the powerful positions, and later we see the ascendancy of the Omi households. By the 7th century, however, it appears that Omi came first, followed by Muraji, at least based on the order that individuals are frequently named in the Chronicles, among other things. As for other titles, some of them we believe we know, and others are a bit of a mystery. The origin of Wake and Kimi are rather obscure, though they both appear to have something to do with territorial rule and belonging to Uji that lay some kind of claim to a blood relationship with the royal house. Some of them may have been rulers in their own lands prior to Yamato hegemony. Inaki might be related to rice castle or storehouse, and seems to have referred to one of the smallest local units. That also means we rarely see it in the narrative, which tended to focus on those more closely tied to the court and the royal house. Asakawa notes that the Atahe or Atahe seemed to be an Uji for people who possessed some amount of private land and private soldiery, but we don't know much more. Asakawa also points out that the Suguri, Tamitsukasa, and the Kishi Kabane all seem to be related to groups with ties to the continent, perhaps descended from various immigrant groups. The Kuni no Miyatsuko and the Agata Nushi are the titles with the clearest seeming ties to territorial hegemony. Kuni is the term for the ancient land, such as Yamato, Kibi, Kinu, Koshi, etc. There seem to be around 140 such kuni described in the archipelago. Agata, on the other hand, were much smaller districts. While some of these districts' names have survived, it is hard, if not impossible, to know exactly how many of them there were back in the day. Then you have this term, Miyatsuko. Now, breaking that apart, it is translated by Asakawa as child or servant, ko, of the exalted house, Miya. Taken together, these appear to reference the elite families in charge of overseeing territorial lands. We also see another term that uses Miyatsuko, Tomo no Miyatsuko. Now, unlike Kuni no Miyatsuko, Tomo no Miyatsuko is a term representing really kind of a group of different Uji rather than a Kabane that was attached to any individual family. When the sovereign addresses the court, for example, he typically addresses the Omi, the Muraji, the Tomo no Miyatsuko, and the Kuni no Miyatsuko. That's pretty much everybody. Asakawa proposed that technically all of these could fall under the term of Miyatsuko as servants of the sovereign's house. Rather than focusing on specifics of all the myriad Kabane, Asakawa treats them broadly as the Omi, Muraji, the Tomo no Miyatsuko, and the Kuni no Miyatsuko, just like it is given in several edicts. Now, the Omi and the Muraji we already touched on. They were the houses that could, among other things, supply the court with their O-Omi and O-Muraji, the prime ministers, so that makes some sense. The Tomo no Miyatsuko and the Kuni no Miyatsuko are a little more tricky to pin down, but Asakawa suggests that based on what we can tell, the heads of the Omi, Muraji, and Tomo no Miyatsuko likely were those that attended court on a regular basis, and they probably lived nearby, or at least their head chiefs did, whereas the Kuni no Miyatsuko were those whose heads dwelt elsewhere, likely because they were local elites in various other areas of the archipelago. This is in the name. The term tomo might be thought of as being with someone, and at one point it is suggested that the tomo no miyatsuko are those who are related to people who trace their kinship all the way back to kami, who originally descended from the plane of heaven, along with the heavenly sovereign. However, among the myriad kabane, not all of them were strictly local, and we find some kabane doing double duty for both local and geographically dispersed uji. Thus, Asakawa also suggested that the kuni no miyatsuko, though it was a kabane in its own right, also represented all the other forms of territorial elite titles, basically all those who did not regularly attend the court, but instead administered their own lands. So they used that one title in kind of two different ways. Now, Richard Miller, in his work, Ancient Japanese Nobility, does provide a suggested hierarchy of the kabane. I don't know if I completely agree, as I think it was a lot more complicated across the entire archipelago, but nonetheless, I'll add the information to the blog post page if you want to see at least one suggestion of relative precedence between uji of different kabane. Now, let's not forget that not everyone was a member of an uji. For one thing, the royal family, both the sovereign's immediate family and princes who claimed a more distant relationship, were exempt from the uji kabane system. Also, the commoners, those who actually toiled and worked the land, well, they likewise would not have been included in a given uji. The uji may have directed production and even included certain artisans, but it still only included those who were tied in some way to the government. Now, while the uji kabane system may have started as titles with actual meanings, that is to say, the names and titles were essentially indicative of a group's role in society, it didn't take too long for it to become a little more abstract. After all, generation after generation, people change. Individuals vied for power and position in court and elsewhere, and one's uji may rise and even fall, depending on how they were able to succeed in the political climate of the day. This was augmented with the marriage politics, which no doubt was conducted as much between the elite families as well as between the elite and royal families. And there were the branch or cadet families. For example, let's say that the head of a family has 4 children, and each one of those children could theoretically succeed their father, assuming his own siblings don't do so. With each generation, the familial ties get weaker and weaker, and soon smaller sub-houses could form. If the uji was geographically dispersed, then local branches could become more or less independent. All of this seems to have caused not a small bit of confusion, and thus we get an edict in the last months of 682, and it instructed all of the uji to ensure that they had a senior member, an uji no kami or kono kami, with kami in this instance meaning top or head rather than deity, and this family head was to be reported to the government, presumably so that the government knew exactly who was in charge of each family. If there were too many people in a given uji, then they were encouraged to split themselves up and submit their own heads, with government officials adjudicating the decision. Finally, they are exhorted not to include any people that do not belong. So a few things this seems to indicate. First is that the government did not have a handle on all the different families out there, which makes some sense. It had, after all, been many generations since the uji had been initially set up, and the state had gone through a lot in that period. It may also indicate that there were those making a false claim to a family name specifically for the added prestige. How difficult would it be to claim to be a member from a prominent family that just happened to be from some far-flung, out-of-the-way branch? I'm sure you never heard of it. We see this, for example, in the 10th century with the Oshu Fujiwara, a family in Tohoku around the region of Hiraizumi, who came to power in that region, and they claimed descent from the famous Fujiwara family. Of course, the Fujiwara family by that point had grown so large that it was next to impossible to check any such claim, how much more so in the age before written records were common. Now, we've seen examples where different parts of a given uji were recorded separately. For example, the aya were split into different groups pretty early on, with the Yamato no aya being perhaps the most often referenced, but we also have the Kawachi no aya, the aya from Kawachi. And then we have the Inukai, where we see the Ama no Inukai and the Agata no Inukai. This refers to the Inukai of the sea and the Inukai of the district, though sometimes just a reference to Inukai generally. Of course, it also seems that these branch families maintained the kabane of the original. Over time, uji were promoted, but rarely were they demoted, at least from the records we have. And so over time, more and more Uji are counted among the ranks of the Omi and the Muraji. At the same time, the court was changing. With the Taika reforms and the development of the Ritsuryo codes, the Uji Kabane system was no longer required for managing the realm. Furthermore, the government was centralizing land and the produce thereof. And so they instituted the cap rank system, a more explicit system of rank within the court that was held by the individual, not by the entire Uji. In addition, cap rank could be tied directly to a stipend, making the court officials more dependent on the central government rather than on their own Uji's resources. Now, early on, it is likely that higher cap rank was given to members of the more highly exalted Uji, as those were the Uji that also filled the upper echelons of government and therefore would have been best prepared to succeed in those roles. However, as things continued, it was likely that it was going to get even more confused than that, or they would need to raise up all the families to Omi and Muraji status. But as that happened, the meaning of the Kabane themselves became less and less clear. After all, if everyone is an Omi and Muraji, then really nobody is. In 681, we are told that a law code of 92 articles is said to have been established. However, it seems it was still being updated through probably the late 680s, as it wasn't until 689 with Oama's death that all 22 volumes would be distributed to the various governors. It became known as the Kiyomihara Codes. In 684, Oama's reforms attacked the problem of Kabane. The record complains that the various titles had become confused, that there were people out there taking Kabane they were not entitled to, and just a general confusion because it no longer aligned quite so well with the evolving cultural norms of the new Yamato state. Early attempts to deal with this appear to have been in the years since they began codifying it all, back in 681. Well, first to raise up families and individuals to the rank of Muraji. There are several records where lists of families are all given Muraji. And in the case of individuals being granted Muraji, it is unclear if that was going just to them or to their entire family. Though there are some examples where it seems an individual was granted the title, and then their Uji was separately awarded the same. Now, this seems like an initial attempt to straighten things out. With a new bureaucratic system in the court ranks, no doubt there were people of worth from Uji with less prestigious Kabane who now outranked individuals from Uji that were, at least on paper, more prestigious. And this can't really have solved the problem. If anything, it just watered down the meaning of Muraji even further, since now everyone and their brother seemed to have been granted that title. Owama's solution was to then pare down the system to only 8 Kabane total. Some of these were existing Kabane and others were entirely new. At the bottom of this new system was the title of Inaki, which had been about the lowest territorial Kabane of the existing system. I suspect that this included all those families that were still below the rank of Muraji who had not been raised up in the preceding years. However, from there, it immediately jumped up to the Muraji and Omi in that order. And so the Kabane that were previously at the very top of the system were now kind of towards the bottom. That way they could promote families into greater Kabane without needing to demote a bunch of existing families at the same time. Now above the Omi were mostly new Kabane, except for one. The first was Michinoshi, a master of the way. It is unclear what this was intended for, as we aren't told who was promoted to this Kabane. Based on the name, it's thought that this may have been for Uji that had demonstrated a mastery of learning or perhaps some other pursuit, such as medicine, science, crafts, etc. Now above the Michinoshi title was the Kabane of Imiki, the fourth of 8. This may mean something like one who arrived. Some suggest that it may have originally been Imaki, and Richard Miller in his work suggests that this was effectively the equivalent of the old title of Atahe. That said, most of those who received this Kabane had previously been promoted to the old title of Muraji, though before that, they were mostly Atahe or else Obito, Kishi, or Miyatsuko. There is a thought that Imiki had something to do with coming and was meant for Uji descended from immigrant families, those that came to Japan. Miller notes that this is not immediately borne out in the data from the Nihon Shoki, where we see about a 50-50 split between immigrant and native Uji. However, in the following chronicle, the Shoku Nihongi, we see about 100 of 150 Uji with the Imiki Kabane that were of immigrant origin. So at that point, 2/3. That still isn't entirely conclusive, but it does add some weight to the idea. Now, continuing to the third Kabane in this new system, we are at Sukune. This was previously used as a Kabane, but from what I can tell, it seems to have been given to individuals. It wasn't passed down to the entire Uji. Now it was something different. Miller suggests that this Kabane was for those Uji who claim descent from one of the kami, but not necessarily from the royal lineage. In contrast, the next grade, Asumi, later read Ason, the second of the 8 Kabane, literally reads as court minister. It appears to be for those who claim some connection to the royal family. It's notable that Owama awarded this to some 52 families during his reign. Compare that with him making only 11 Imiki and only 13 Mabito, the next and highest ranking Kabane. Asumi would be the most common Kabane among those at the top of the court bureaucracy. Of all of them, this one seems to linger, perhaps because it was the Kabane that was given to the Fujiwara family, who then carried it on with them into later centuries. I'm not entirely sure. Finally, there is Mabito. Mabito means something like true person, or perhaps upright person, and it seems to have gone exclusively to families with the old Kabane of Kimi. An examination of the 13 Uji in this group indicates that they were those with close royal ties who claimed a descent closely related to that of the royal family. So those were the 8 new Kabane. Although they were declared in 684 and handed out through the following year, we do see some individuals referenced with these Kabane earlier in the narrative. This is likely just due to the fact that it's how they were eventually known, and so they're given with an anachronistic Kabane, which was probably much easier for the compilers than trying to make sure that all the names were exactly correct for each and every record. Now, with the Kabane thus dealt with, Owama then went on to make some major changes to the court rank system. In many ways, I would say that his ranks were quite novel. Previous changes to the cap rank system had largely been additions or slight modifications, but had left many of the names intact with each change. As such, the rank system decreed in 664 was really just an update to the previous cap rank system of 649 and earlier. And so even through 664, heck, even through 684, you still had things like greater brocade as someone's rank. Towards the end of his reign, though, along with other reforms to the government, Owama was going to take care of this. Now, determining what exactly the rank system was at any given point can be a little confusing. Depending on the record being used, names are sometimes referenced anachronistically. That is, they're given with the ultimate title, Kabane, or rank by whichever they were known. This could sometimes be after multiple phases of reform, and so the honors mentioned may not necessarily reflect that individual's ranks and position at the date of the entry. Also, the various rank systems are close enough, sharing many of the various rank names, such that it isn't immediately obvious if something different is being used, at least in the old system. This is true of both Kabane and court ranks. Furthermore, as many individuals may only be mentioned once or twice, we may not always have a lot of data on how things may have changed. The new system, enacted in 685, was different in several ways that make it quite distinct. In fact, we see in the record of this reign earlier mentions of individuals where the rank is given in terms of the new system, even though those records predate 685. So, what exactly did it look like? Well, the rank system of 685 still used various signifiers, which broke things up into categories, but these themselves were broken up into 2 to 4 numerical grades. Ichi, ni, san, ni, shi, or first rank, second rank, third rank, and fourth rank, or something like that. This gets us closer to what was eventually an almost purely numerical system. Each grade was then divided further into larger, dai, or broader, ko. This is also where we see princely ranks enumerated for the first time. As we noted previously, princely rank was something that we started to see at the beginning of this reign, in the Nihon Shoki anyway. For instance, Prince of the Third Rank, or something like that. In 685, however, we get an actual proclamation. Now, the princely ranks are broken into two large categories: the bright or myo ranks and the pure or jo ranks. There were 2 grades of myo, ichi and ni, and 4 grades of jo, ichi, ni, sani, and shi. Each grade was further divided twice into large, dai, or broad, ko. So you had, for example, myo dai ichi, myo ko ichi, myo dai ni, myo ko ni, etc., etc., etc. That translates to something like large first bright rank, broad first bright rank, large second bright rank, and broad second bright rank. This would continue with jo replacing myo and provide a total of 12 princely ranks. As for how they were divvied out, we only see the granting of jo ranks. In fact, Kusakabe, the crown prince himself, is just given broader pure first rank, jo ko ichi. His brother, Prince Otsu, was given larger pure second rank. Their brother Takechi, who had helped lead the forces in the Jinshin War, was given broader pure second rank, one lower than his younger brother. Both Kawashima and Osakabe were given large pure third rank, so if the highest pure rank was going to the crown prince, then who were the myo ranks going to? Unfortunately, though the system would last until the development of the Taiho Code in 703, we don't have any clear examples of any of the myo ranks being handed out, so that may be a puzzle we just don't unravel. Beyond the ranks for the various princes, there was another similar set of ranks for the common court nobles. This system had 6 categories broken up like the princely ranks into 4 grades, each further divided into larger and broader as before. In this case, the categories were sho, upright, jiki, straight, gon, diligent, mu, earnest, tsui, pursue, shin, advancement. This created 48 total rank divisions, which gave an unprecedented granularity for the court to leverage. As for granting rank, we have a couple of examples of that beyond just the posthumous granting of rank. In 686, for example, Oama conferred Gon-i, the diligent rank, on 6 ministers who attended to him personally. There was also a request that provincial governors should select 9 people of achievement who could also be given the same. There is one strange account. In 685, Awata no Asomi no Mabito, Mabito in this case being his given name, requested permission to transfer his rank to his father, but this was refused. And I think that gets to the heart of the cultural change that was underway, and which Oama and the court was actively encouraging. Although the Kabane titles were a collective rank, court rank and the accompanying stipend was for the individual. This wasn't something that could accrue to the head of a family. That would have been an important point at a time when the traditions of the Uji system were still quite strong. So there we have it. Hopefully there was something new for you to take away as we come to better understand Oama and his court in this late 7th century. We still have plenty more to discuss, mind you, probably enough for a few more episodes as we cover some of the natural events and disasters, the ties between the court and religion, as well as what was going on with peninsular affairs, not to mention the myriad other little random tidbits. And we'll get to all of that as we can. Next episode, we'll take a look at the material culture of the court. Specifically, we'll take a look at what we know about their dress and clothing, much of which was influenced by the sumptuary laws that were themselves tied in closely with this new rank system. So until then, remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.